Was the heart of the ocean from Titanic real? Okay, well the short answer is no, it wasn't, but kind of. This particular diamond was made up just for the movie. It was completely fictional, but there were replicas made after the movie came out. One of them sold for $1.4 million, and Celine Dion wore it to the 1998 Academy Awards. The heart of the ocean does share similarities with two real jewels though. The first being that it shares a similar backstory to the Hope Diamond, which is a real diamond. It weighs 45.52 carats. It was worn by Louis XIV, and today you can find it in the Smithsonian Museum. Next, there was a real couple on Titanic that shares a similar story to what we see in the movie Titanic. This is Kate Florence Phillips and Henry Samuel Morley. Kate was 19, Henry was 38. Basically, he was married, Kate was an employee of Henry's, and they started a secret love affair. Henry then gifted her this beautiful necklace. It was actually a sapphire, and then they boarded the Titanic with the hopes of starting a new life in America. Sadly, Henry did not survive, but Kate and the necklace did, and today it's known as the Love of the Sea and believed to be on display at the SS Nomadic Museum. What exactly happened to Titanic's lifeboats after the sinking? Well, unfortunately, this question really remains a mystery to this day. But here's what we do know. The rescue ship Carpathia, being a smaller ship, only had room to take on 13 lifeboats. The rest were set adrift, including the collapsibles, and in fact, they actually recovered collapsible A and found 3 decomposing bodies inside. Once they reached New York, the lifeboats were placed in the White Star Line pier where Titanic would have been docked. At this point, things get a little sketchy. We know that White Star Line employees went to the lifeboats and recovered any nameplates and flags, and then the lifeboats were stored somewhere in the pier. It's then believed that souvenir hunters tried to remove some artifacts from the boat, and according to some, the boats were destroyed. However, based on this picture, many people believe that Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, actually picked those lifeboats up. And then the lifeboats were fitted onto the Olympic to keep up with the new regulations. Today you can find some replica lifeboats in museums around the world, but we'll never truly know what actually happened to Titanic's lifeboats. So this is something I've been asked about in the past. It's a tough but fair question. How did people die on the Titanic? I want to take you through a couple of the common causes of death. So first off, we have drowning. Although it's listed as the most common cause of death by 1912 authorities, we know that that wasn't actually the case. Those who did drown were most likely crew members and passengers who were stuck below deck. Next, we have hypothermia, which was the leading cause of death. You gotta remember that most people actually made it off the Titanic and went into the Atlantic Ocean. However, the water was freezing, so most healthy individuals only survived up to 15 minutes. Basically, you're so cold you fall asleep and never wake back up. Next, you have natural causes. It's believed that some elderly passengers, upon hitting the frigid water, actually just died of a heart attack. Next, you have crushing or injury. We know for a fact that people died because of falling debris. John Jacob Astor was believed to have been crushed by the funnel, for example. And finally, compression from the water pressure. It's believed some people were dragged all the way to the bottom based on the shoes found in the debris field. Fun Titanic movie mistake, except it's not really a mistake, but some of you think it is. So a bunch of you have pointed out that there's a mistake in this scene, and I even saw a TikTok about it, where basically Jack makes a reference to Nickelodeon and the fact that Nickelodeon didn't even exist in 1912. And I mean, you're not wrong about Nickelodeon, the channel. If you do a quick Google search, you can see that it was clearly founded in 1977. However, he's not talking about the channel, obviously. He's talking about this, a Nickelodeon movie theater. So what exactly is that? Basically, a Nickelodeon was a pop-up movie theater that was really popular in the early 1900s. Basically, they would play a bunch of different types of short movies. They were normally around 15 minutes long, and the reason why they called it a Nickelodeon was because it typically cost around 5 cents or a nickel. So basically an early version of a modern day movie theater. So putting this back into context, Jack doesn't say, I saw that on Nickelodeon. He says, I saw that in a Nickelodeon.
Saw that in a Nickelodeon once.
So now you know what he's talking about. So something I always get asked about is, why were there no binoculars on the Titanic, and could they have prevented the disaster? So let me try to explain everything. All right, well, first of all, let me clarify that that's actually not quite true. According to Second Officer Lightoller, there were actually 5 pairs of binoculars on the Titanic. However, the story that's often told, which is true by the way, is that there was a mix-up with the officers. As I explained in the video right before this, Chief Officer Wilde was transferred onto the Titanic at the very last minute. This caused a reshuffle in rank with the senior officers, and one of those officers actually just left the Titanic. This officer was named David Blair, and he was originally the 2nd officer. Now, before he left, he locked his binoculars and took the key with him. Before the ship set sail, these were the binoculars that were being used by lookouts. But why were they never replaced? Well, the answer is that they weren't actually standard equipment for lookouts at the time. They didn't want them to look at things in detail. Even Lightoller himself testified that he wanted someone to be able to identify something and then strike the bells. So would binoculars have made a difference? In my opinion, no. Lookouts were trained to spot with their eye first, which they did. Should the Titanic have hit the iceberg head on? So many people argue that it would have been much better for Titanic to just smash straight into the iceberg because it wouldn't have sunk. And I see a lot of you having some pretty spirited discussions about this, so let me give you my perspective. Now, the question is, would Titanic have stayed afloat with a head-on collision? And I say, yeah, it's entirely possible. The reason why Titanic sank is because 6 of her watertight compartments were breached. With a head-on collision, only the first 2 or 3 compartments would have been affected, and Titanic could have stayed afloat. However, there would have been significant structural damage to the bow of the ship, not to mention hundreds of people would have died on impact, the crew and the third-class men that were berthed here. I mean, that damage would have been catastrophic. Now, was this a plausible scenario? Absolutely not. There's no way a senior officer in the middle of the ocean would have willingly rammed a brand new ship straight into an iceberg. It just wouldn't have happened. We have the benefit of hindsight to compare the likely outcomes, but in that split-second decision, by no stretch of the imagination would that order have ever been given. Titanic theory. Was the Titanic really on fire, and was that the true cause of the sinking? Many of you have asked me about this, so the short answer is yes and no. Let me explain. It is in fact true that there was a fire in Titanic's coal bunker. And this was well known back in 1912. It came out in the inquiries after the sinking. So people knew that the fire started before the ship set sail, and it was put out on Saturday, April 13th. So was there a fire? Yes, absolutely. Now, in 2017, there was this documentary that came out, Titanic, The New Evidence, where basically they make the claim that the fire was the true reason for the sinking. One of the reasons they cite is that they have a picture, they enhance it, and they found some burn marks, according to them. This theory has been debunked several times, and there was a peer-reviewed paper called Titanic Fire and Ice where they go through each one of the points and basically say how it's not plausible. To begin with, the burn marks are nowhere close to where the fire actually took place, between Boiler Room 6 and Boiler Room 5. They also claim that the fire weakened the metal, which has also been disproven. The fire would have had to have been massive. I'll have to make a part 2, but the fire did not cause the sinking. Titanic Fire Theory Part 2. I want to talk about how the fire itself saved the Titanic and prevented the disaster from being much, much worse. Let me explain. So we know that there was indeed a coal bunker fire. Now, a few years ago, Titanic historian Park Stevenson put out an article called Titanic's Guardian Angel, where basically he says that the fire itself helped the Titanic during the sinking. Okay, so how's that possible? How does that work? So in order to put out the fire, all the coal was moved from the starboard side of the ship to the port side of the ship. Around 600 tons of coal were moved from this bunker into that bunker. Now, the extra weight caused the Titanic to list to port around 2.5 degrees. This is very important because during the sinking, the starboard side of the ship started taking on water first. This port list acted as a counterbalance and prevented the Titanic from capsizing to the starboard side. Experts have run simulations showing that without this port side list, the Titanic would have literally flipped over after about an hour. So had there been no fire, it's entirely possible there would have been 0 survivors. And that's why the fire was Titanic's guardian angel. Did First Officer Murdoch turn the Titanic the wrong way? So a lot of you guys have brought up this really good question. Why did First Officer Murdoch issue a hardest starboard order, but the ship turned to port? Was that a mistake? And the answer is no, that was not a mistake. So in case you don't know, in nautical terms, starboard refers to the right and port refers to the left. In the early days of shipping, boats were controlled with a tiller. So in order for you to turn, you actually had to turn that tiller in the opposite direction, like you see here. So if you wanted to turn left, you had to move the tiller to the right. Now, as steamships came about in the late 19th century, these tillers were replaced by actual wheels that could turn in the proper direction. So if you wanted to turn starboard, you turn the wheel starboard. However, in 1912, sailors were still using traditional tiller orders, which meant that in order to turn one direction, you had to give the order in the opposite direction. So on April 14th, when Murdoch gave the order hardest starboard, Quartermaster Hitchens understood immediately that that meant to turn the wheel to port. The RMS Carpathia is a name you probably recognize as the ship that rescued Titanic's passengers. The Carpathia was a British ocean liner owned by Titanic's rival company, the Cunard Line. On April 15th, Carpathia was steaming toward the Mediterranean when at 12:11 a.m., Titanic's distress signal was received. The wireless operator awakened Captain Arthur Rostron, who immediately sprang into action and gave the order to turn the ship around. The crew worked to prepare the ship to take on more passengers, and 3.5 hours later, they reached Titanic's location. By this point, only Titanic's lifeboats remained, and the crew began the rescue effort. By 9 a.m., just over 700 people had been saved. According to Titanic survivors, Carpathia's passengers were incredibly helpful during the rescue. They offered their staterooms, blankets, their toiletries until they finally reached New York on April 18th. The crew of the Carpathia would later be awarded medals by Titanic passengers for their part in the rescue. Carpathia went back into service, but unfortunately on July 17, 1918, she was sunk by a German U-boat.